Nietzsche's most dangerous discovery wasn't about morality or religion. It was about what happens when a human being looks deeply into the abyss of their own being and discovers that they are much more powerful and much more dangerous than they ever imagined. In his most private works, Nietzsche documented what happens when someone breaks free from the chains of conventional morality and faces a truth that few have the courage to admit, that each person carries within themselves not just the domesticated lamb, but also the predatory wolf, not just the saint, but also the monster, not just the slave, but also the master, and that true human power only emerges when we stop running from this duality and learn to integrate it. Are you afraid of your own power? Do you instinctively shrink back when you realize how deep your influence on others can be? Do you choose to remain small because the alternative, your true potential, seems too frightening to be tolerated? Then you need to hear what Nietzsche discovered during decades studying those rare individuals he called free spirits, people who had the courage to go beyond the boundaries of conventional morality, to discover what really exists beyond good and evil. Today I will show how Nietzsche's philosophy is not just abstract theory, but a practical map for the most dangerous and unexplored territory that exists, your own psychology. I will explain why Nietzsche believed that most people live as the last man, comfortable, mediocre, domesticated, not because they are incapable of greatness, but because they have been conditioned to fear their own power, and how his concept of the Übermensch is not about domination, as many misinterpret, but about the courage to integrate the wildest and most primitive aspects of our nature with our highest ideals. If you're ready to explore what exists beyond the civilized surface of your being, keep watching. What Nietzsche discovered about human nature can completely transform your understanding not just of philosophy, but of yourself. It all begins with a simple question that Nietzsche formulated in his book, Beyond Good and Evil. What if morality, far from being a compass for virtue, is actually a sophisticated form of human domestication? What if the values we have been taught are good, humility, altruism, obedience, are not universal virtues, but clever strategies created by the weak to control the strong? Nietzsche identified two fundamental types of morality that shaped Western civilization. The first, which he called master morality, values strength, courage, brutal honesty, and pride. The second, slave morality, exalts humility, meekness, compassion, and obedience. Christianity, in Nietzsche's view, represented the historical triumph of slave morality over master morality, what he called the slave revolt in morality. Here's what few understand about Nietzsche. He wasn't simply advocating a return to master morality. His vision was much deeper and more revolutionary. He believed that true human greatness emerges when an individual completely transcends both moral systems and creates their own values, based not on social conventions or religious dogmas, but on a radical affirmation of life in all its dimensions. In Nietzsche's personal archives, we find fascinating accounts of individuals he observed during his travels across Europe, people who showed signs of this moral transcendence. A Russian aristocrat who abandoned his fortune to live as an ascetic in the mountains, an Italian artist who created works of transcendent beauty while living a life that many would consider depraved, a Swiss woman who defied all the conventions of her time to follow her own intellectual principles. What did these people have in common? They had accomplished what Nietzsche called the transvaluation of values, the ability to radically question the basis of their own morality, and then forge a new set of values based not on what others expected of them, but on what their deepest natures demanded. To understand why this is so revolutionary, we need to return to what Nietzsche identified as the central psychological force shaping human morality: resentment. In his work on the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche argues that resentment, the poisonous feeling that arises when we feel powerless before those we perceive as more powerful, is the creative force behind conventional morality. Nietzsche wrote, "The slave revolt in morality begins when resentment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. The weak, unable to express their aggression directly against the strong, invent a moral system in which weakness becomes virtue, blessed are the meek, and strength becomes vice. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven." But here is Nietzsche's true insight, which still terrifies philosophers today. This resentment is not just directed at others. It is, more deeply, a resentment against life itself, against the fact that life is inevitably suffering, struggle, and eventual death. Conventional morality at its core is a rejection of life as it really is, in favor of an imaginary ideal of how it should be. Now, to the core of Nietzsche's discovery, what happens when an individual frees themselves from this resentment against life and begins to say yes to everything that existence offers, including suffering, pain, and death. The result, according to Nietzsche, is what he called amor fati, love of fate, the ability to affirm life exactly as it is, without wishing it were different. It's important to understand that Nietzsche's amor fati is not passive resignation or fatalism. Quite the contrary. It is the most radical possible acceptance of reality as a basis for transformation. Instead of wasting energy wishing things were different, the individual who has achieved amor fati channels all their vitality into transforming what is into something even more powerful and beautiful. This leads us to Nietzsche's most famous and frequently misunderstood concept, the Übermensch, sometimes translated as Superman or Overman. The Übermensch is not a superior race or a cruel tyrant, as many erroneously interpret. It is the human being who has overcome resentment against life and achieved the capacity to create affirmative rather than reactive values. In Nietzsche's personal diaries, we find a revealing passage about a man he met in Turin, a former monk who had abandoned his vows after a profound spiritual crisis. This man described to Nietzsche his transformation. "For years I lived in denial of everything natural in me. I called my most basic desires, my anger, my sexuality, my ambition, sin. I lived in constant self-punishment. Then one day I realized that this moral system I embraced was not divine, but human, all too human. It was created not by God, but by men. Weak and fearful men like me. At that moment I felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time, I saw life not as a vale of tears to be endured, but as a glorious opportunity to create beauty. This transformation, from living in denial of life to a radical affirmation of existence, is precisely what Nietzsche had in mind with his vision of the Übermensch. It is not something supernatural or superhuman, but simply the human being who has overcome resentment against life and learned to say yes instead of no. Have you ever experienced moments when your entire view of reality changed radically? Moments when values you unquestioningly accepted suddenly seemed arbitrary or even oppressive? If so, you've had a glimpse of what Nietzsche called perspectivism, the understanding that there is no single objective truth, only interpretations of reality shaped by our individual perspectives. Nietzsche's perspectivism is often misinterpreted as a cheap moral relativism, where anything goes and nothing really matters. But this is a gross caricature of his philosophy. For Nietzsche, although there is no absolute objective truth, there are certainly perspectives that are more powerful, more affirmative, and more life-enhancing than others. A central principle of Nietzsche's perspectivism is that the more different perspectives we can incorporate, the more eyes we have to see the world, the more complete our understanding of reality will be. This implies a radical openness to difference and otherness, not an arrogant rejection of different worldviews. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche wrote, "There is only a perspective seeing, only a perspective knowing, and the more effects we allow to speak about a thing, the more different eyes we can use to observe one thing, the more complete will our concept of this thing, our objectivity, be." This insight leads to one of Nietzsche's most profound psychological discoveries, the idea that what we call the self is not a single, unified entity, but a multiplicity of drives, instincts, and wills often in conflict. In his own words, the subject is not something given, but something added and invented and projected behind what there is. Nietzsche observed that most people spend their lives trying to repress this internal multiplicity in the name of an illusion of unity and coherence. They try to be good by denying everything they consider bad in themselves. They try to be rational by suppressing their instincts and emotions. They try to be civilized by taming their wild nature. The result, according to Nietzsche, is a diminished, impoverished, and ultimately inauthentic life. This is where we arrive at one of Nietzsche's most profound and radical concepts, the will to power. Misunderstood as a simple desire for domination over others, the will to power is actually much more fundamental. It is the basic drive of all living beings not just to survive, but to expand, grow, and overcome resistances. In his posthumous fragments, Nietzsche wrote, "What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that resistance is overcome. Life in its essence is will to power, not necessarily power over others, but power as the capacity for self-overcoming, for becoming more than one is. This manifests in different ways in different people. For the artist, it is the power to create beauty from chaos. For the thinker, it is the power to forge new concepts and insights. For the athlete, it is the power to transcend physical limits. What all these examples have in common is the drive to expand. to grow, to become more. Nietzsche saw conventional morality as a denial of this will to power, an attempt to domesticate and weaken what is most vital and dynamic in human nature. True psychological health, according to Nietzsche, comes not from the denial of the will to power, but from its conscious and directed affirmation. Here is where Nietzsche becomes truly dangerous to the established order. He suggests that most social institutions, religion, state, education, function to channel and domesticate the will to power, transforming wild and powerful human beings into docile and obedient citizens. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes about what he calls the last man, the end result of this domestication. The last man is the human being who has lost all ambition, all desire for greatness, all capacity for admiration or contempt. He seeks only comfort, security, and a lukewarm, mediocre happiness. We have invented happiness, says the last man, blinking. Nietzsche's fierce critique of the institutions of his time was not motivated by nihilism or cynicism, as some have interpreted, but by a deep love for life and human potential. He saw the social structures of his time as fundamentally limiting, preventing people from expressing the totality of their being and reaching their full potential. What does Nietzsche propose instead? Not a complete rejection of all morality or social structure, but a radical transvaluation, a re-evaluation of all values from the perspective of life affirmation. This means questioning each value, each truth, each dogma with the question, does this increase or diminish life? Does this expand or contract the will to power? Does this make us stronger or weaker? This transvaluation is not merely an intellectual exercise, but a visceral practice of self-experimentation. In Nietzsche's most personal writings, we find vivid descriptions of his own struggles with debilitating health, social isolation, and incomprehension from his contemporaries. Through these trials, he forged his philosophy not as an abstract theory, but as a way of life. What does this mean for you today? How can Nietzsche's philosophy be applied to your life in the 21st century? Start by questioning your most fundamental values. Where do they come from? Did you choose them consciously, or did you passively absorb them from family, culture, religion, or media? Do they expand your life or contract it? Do they increase your power or diminish it? Do they arise from life affirmation or from resentment against life? Nietzsche invites us to see morality not as a fixed code of universal rules, but as a work of art in constant evolution, something we continuously create through our choices and actions. This doesn't mean that anything goes, in a simplistic sense, but that we are responsible for creating values that enhance life rather than diminish it. The second aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy that you can apply to your life is the concept of becoming who you are, a phrase he borrowed from Pindar and transformed into one of the central principles of his philosophy. This means discovering and affirming your deepest nature, with all its contradictions and complexities, rather than trying to mold yourself according to external expectations. This is not a simple task. As Nietzsche observed in Exe Homo, to become what one is, one must not have the faintest notion what one is. Paradoxically, to become who you are, you must first recognize that you don't know who you are, that the identity you believe you possess is, to a large extent, a social construction, a collection of masks and roles you've learned to play. The process of becoming who you are involves what Nietzsche called the free spirit, the capacity to question everything you believe to be true about yourself and the world. In Human, All Too Human, he writes, a free spirit. This concept will be understood when I have said that one who calls himself a free spirit may have merely cut the moorings of his ship, or broken the ice to sail with the current. Such persons are by no means free spirits. They merely have more room for movement. The true free spirit is not the libertine who simply gives in to all impulses, nor the rebel who automatically rejects all conventions. It is the individual who has conquered the internal freedom to critically examine each belief, each value, each aspect of their identity, and consciously choose which to affirm and which to reject. This leads to the third and perhaps most challenging aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy, the eternal return. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche proposes a thought experiment. What if a demon told you that you would have to live your life exactly as it was, with every moment of pain and joy, every triumph and failure infinitely repeated? Would you curse this demon, or worship it as a god? The eternal return is not, for Nietzsche, a literal cosmological theory, but an existential test. If you cannot affirm your life exactly as it is, with all its moments of suffering and anguish, then you still live under the sign of resentment. You still wish that life were different than it is. You still haven't achieved amor fati. In his most personal writings, Nietzsche describes his own path to amor fati through years of debilitating illness, isolation, and incomprehension. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it, but love it. This is the radical challenge that Nietzsche throws down to us. Can we love not just the moments of joy and pleasure, but also those of pain and suffering? Can we affirm life in its totality, without exceptions? Can we say yes, not just to what pleases us, but also to what challenges us, hurts us, breaks us? And this brings us to the concept that, perhaps more than any other, defines Nietzsche's philosophy, the death of God. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche places these famous words in the mouth of a madman who runs through the marketplace: God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. This is not a simple declaration of atheism, it is a profound cultural diagnosis. What Nietzsche is announcing is the death not just of the Christian God, but of all absolutes, all metaphysical foundations, all transcendent certainties that previously gave meaning and purpose to human existence. The death of God leaves an existential void that modern humanity has struggled to fill. As Nietzsche asks, do we not stray as through an infinite nothing? Does not empty space breathe upon us? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? But for Nietzsche, this void is not simply a cause for despair, it is also an unprecedented opportunity. With the death of God, human beings face for the first time the possibility of creating genuinely affirmative values, not based on the denial of life in this world in favor of an imaginary beyond, but on the radical affirmation of life as it is. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche describes three transformations of the spirit, from camel to lion and finally to child. The camel represents the spirit of burden that carries the values of tradition, thou shalt. The lion represents the spirit that rebels against these traditions, I will. But only the child, in its innocence and forgetfulness, can finally create new values, a sacred yes. The death of God, therefore, is not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter in human history, where we are called not to passively receive values, but to actively create them. This brings us to the final and perhaps most important aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy for our everyday life, the concept of great style. In his writings on aesthetics, Nietzsche develops the idea that life should be lived as a work of art, not in the superficial sense of mere appearance or display, but in the profound sense of creatively giving form to the raw material of existence. Great style for Nietzsche is the capacity to impose order on chaos without denying the chaos, to create harmony from dissonance without suppressing the dissonance. It is the integration of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, the principle of order, structure, and form with the principle of ecstasy, chaos, and dissolution. Applied to life, great style means living in a way that affirms both joy and suffering, both order and chaos, both creation and destruction. It is to dance on the edge of the abyss, aware of the nothingness that surrounds us, yet still creating beauty and meaning out of that nothingness. Here is where Nietzsche most clearly shows himself to be a philosopher, not of despair, but of profound affirmation. Despite his devastating critique of conventional morality, religion, and metaphysics, he does not leave us in the void of nihilism. Instead, he offers a vision of life as a work of art, of existence as an exercise in continuous creation. In his most personal writings, Nietzsche describes the moment when he conceived the idea of the eternal return during a walk near Sils Maria in Switzerland. He describes it as an almost mystical experience of total affirmation of life, 6,000 feet above sea level and much higher above all human things. This experience of affirmative ecstasy, of saying yes to life in its totality, is the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy. It is not a philosophy of resentment or negation, as many have misinterpreted it, but a philosophy of profound affirmation, a philosophy that challenges us to live so intensely and authentically that we could wish to live each moment infinitely many times. What does this mean in practical terms? It means cultivating what Nietzsche called dangerous virtues: courage, intellectual honesty, self-discipline, resistance to suffering. It means developing what he called the pathos of distance, the capacity to distance oneself from the opinions of the crowd and think for oneself. It means adopting what he described as the gay science, an approach to life that combines intellectual rigor with creative joy. For Nietzsche, the mark of human greatness is not moral perfection according to some external standard, but the intensity of experience, the depth of feeling, the capacity to transform even suffering into something beautiful and meaningful. In one of his lesser-known fragments, Nietzsche wrote, "My humanity is a constant self-overcoming." This is perhaps the most concise formula of his philosophy. The authentic life is not a state to be achieved, but an ongoing process of self-overcoming, a perpetual becoming, a constant self-transformation. If you take Nietzsche's philosophy seriously, you will not find in it a set of rules to live by, but a challenge to create your own rules. You will not find a map of the territory, but an invitation to explore uncharted territories. You will not find definitive answers, but ever deeper questions. Nietzsche does not want followers who adopt his ideas without questioning. He wants readers who use his ideas as springboards for their own thinking. As he wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star, and perhaps this is, after all, the most profound invitation of Nietzschean philosophy, not to fear the chaos within us, not to run from the multiplicity of drives, instincts, and desires that constitute us, but to embrace them as the raw material from which we can create something beautiful, something powerful, something genuinely our own. Nietzsche's philosophy is ultimately a philosophy for creators, not just artists in the conventional sense, but creators of values, of meaning, of themselves. It is a philosophy that challenges us to live so intensely and authentically that we can look back without regret, that we can say to life once more, and again, if you've ever wondered whether you're living according to values you truly chose, or just following the path of least resistance, if you've ever felt that there is something deeper, wilder, more authentic in you, that rarely finds expression, if you've ever suspected that there might be more to life than the pursuit of comfort, security, and social approval, then you are ready for the radical challenge that Nietzsche's philosophy represents. Now let's examine more deeply some of Nietzsche's most controversial and frequently misunderstood concepts, starting with his famous declaration, "God is dead." When Nietzsche first announces the death of God in The Gay Science, he puts these words in the mouth of a madman who runs through a marketplace with a lit lantern in broad daylight. The man shouts, "I seek God, I seek God." When the atheists mock him, he responds, "Where has God gone? I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers." This passage reveals something fundamental about Nietzsche's understanding of the death of God. It is not simply that God does not exist, yet it is that we, human beings, have killed him. How? Through the development of modern science, critical thinking, historical consciousness, all the instruments of modernity that have made belief in a personal God increasingly difficult to sustain. But the death of God is not merely an intellectual event. It is a cultural and psychological cataclysm whose consequences, according to Nietzsche, most people have not yet fully comprehended. As the madman says, this deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. What many don't understand about Nietzsche is that he doesn't celebrate the death of God as a conventional atheist would. On the contrary, he sees it as a profoundly problematic event that leaves modern humanity in a precarious existential situation. As he asks in The Gay Science, "How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun?" The death of God means the loss not just of belief in a personal deity, but of the entire metaphysical framework that gave meaning and purpose to human existence. With the death of God, we lose the foundation of our values, the guarantee that life has a purpose, the certainty that suffering has meaning. Nietzsche predicted that this loss would result in a period of nihilism, the feeling that nothing has value or meaning. As he wrote in his posthumous fragments, "What does nihilism mean? That the highest values devaluate themselves. The aim is lacking. Why? Finds no answer." But nihilism, for Nietzsche, is not the end of the story. It is a transitional phase, a moment of crisis that contains within itself the possibility of radical renewal. As he writes in The Will to Power, nihilism as a normal condition can be a symptom of increasing strength or of increasing weakness. Nihilism as weakness, what Nietzsche calls passive nihilism, is a surrender to emptiness, an acceptance of meaninglessness, a capitulation in the face of the absence of transcendent values. Nihilism as strength, active nihilism, is the conscious destruction of old values in preparation for the creation of new ones. It is this active nihilism that Nietzsche seeks to promote, not as an end in itself, but as a necessary preparation for what he calls the transvaluation of all values. With the death of God, human beings face for the first time the possibility of creating genuinely affirmative values, not based on the denial of life in this world in favor of an imaginary beyond, but on the radical affirmation of life as it is. This brings us to another frequently misunderstood concept of Nietzsche's, the Übermensch, or overman. Presented in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the Übermensch is often interpreted as a superman in the physical sense, or as a tyrant who imposes his will on others. But this is a serious distortion of Nietzsche's thought. The Übermensch is best understood as an ideal of human self-overcoming. It is not a superior race or a genius individual, but a symbol of what human beings can become when they transcend the limitations of conventional morality and achieve a radical affirmation of life. As Zarathustra proclaims, man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? The Übermensch represents one who has overcome not just the external limitations imposed by society, but also the internal limitations of resentment and the denial of life. It's important to emphasize that Nietzsche's Übermensch is not an invitation to cruelty or exploitation of others. On the contrary, it is a call for a higher form of generosity that flows not from duty or pious compassion, but from an abundance of power and vitality. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, the noble soul has reverence for itself. Does nobility of soul originate in high birth? By no means. What is needed is that a person not need to lie, to deceive, to conceal. The Übermensch does not dominate others out of resentment or insecurity, but expresses his power as a natural overflow of his vitality. He doesn't need to diminish others to feel great. His greatness is intrinsic, not relative. This leads us to another key concept in Nietzsche's philosophy, the distinction between master morality and slave morality. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche argues that there are two fundamental types of morality that have shaped Western civilization. Master morality, according to Nietzsche, arises from self-affirmation. The good in master morality is what is noble, strong, powerful, honest, direct. The bad is simply what is low, weak, common. This is an aristocratic distinction between good and bad, not between good and evil. Slave morality, in contrast, arises from resentment against the powerful. Here, good is redefined as what was previously considered bad: humility, meekness, patience and suffering. And evil is what was previously considered good: power, strength, self-affirmation, pride. Nietzsche sees the historical triumph of slave morality over master morality, primarily through Christianity, as a revolt in morality where values were completely inverted. What was once considered virtue, strength, pride, nobility, became vice, and what was once considered vice, humility, meekness, self-denial, became virtue. It's important to understand that Nietzsche is not simply endorsing master morality over slave morality. His view is much more complex. He sees both moral systems as human, all too human perspectives, contingent historical creations, not eternal truths. What Nietzsche seeks is not a return to master morality, but a synthesis that incorporates the insights of both perspectives into something new. He values the brutal honesty and realism of master morality, but also recognizes the subversive power and psychological depth of slave morality. Ultimately, Nietzsche seeks a transvaluation of all values in which human beings create affirmative values that neither deny life in the name of transcendent ideals, as in slave morality, nor affirm only the strong and dominating aspects of life, as in master morality. This brings us to Nietzsche's concept that is perhaps the most fundamental for understanding his philosophy: the will to power. Often misinterpreted as a simple desire to dominate others, the will to power is actually a much deeper and more subtle concept in Nietzsche's thought. In his posthumous fragments, Nietzsche defines the will to power as the basic drive of all living beings. A living thing seeks above all to discharge its strength. Life itself is will to power. Self-preservation is only one of the indirect and most frequent results of this. Thus, the will to power is not primarily about controlling others, but about overcoming resistances, expanding capabilities, becoming more than one is. It is a principle of growth and expansion, not just of domination. The will to power manifests in different ways in different people. For the artist, it is the power to create beauty from chaos. For the thinker, it is the power to forge new concepts. For the mystic, it is the power to transcend the ego. What all these examples have in common is the drive to expand, to grow, to become more. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, overpowering of what is alien and weaker, suppression, hardness, imposition of one's own forms, incorporation, and at least, at its mildest, exploitation. This is a passage that many have interpreted as a glorification of cruelty and domination. But what Nietzsche is describing here is not a political program, but an observation about the nature of life at all levels, from the biological to the psychological to the social. The will to power is not something we can choose to have or not have. It is what we are in our essence. The question, for Nietzsche, is not whether we have will to power, but how we express it, whether creatively or destructively, whether affirmatively or reactively. Conventional morality, according to Nietzsche, is a reactive expression of the will to power. It arises from resentment, from the inability to directly affirm one's own strength. It is the will to power of the weak, who can only express their power indirectly, through moral manipulation. The transvaluation that Nietzsche proposes is not the rejection of the will to power, but its reorientation, from reactive expressions based on resentment to affirmative expressions based on an abundance of life. This brings us to what is perhaps Nietzsche's most challenging and profound concept, the eternal return. Presented in The Gay Science and developed in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the eternal return is a thought experiment that Nietzsche proposes as the heaviest weight. Imagine, he suggests, that a demon came to you in your loneliest loneliness and said to you, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust." The question Nietzsche poses is, how would you respond to this demon? Would you curse him as a demon, or worship him as a god for bringing this message? The eternal return is not, for Nietzsche, a literal cosmological theory, but an existential test. If you cannot affirm your life exactly as it is, with all its moments of suffering and anguish, then you still live under the sign of resentment. You still wish that life were different than it is. You still haven't achieved amor fati. Amor fati, love of fate, is the attitude that Nietzsche considers the highest expression of life affirmation. As he writes in Ecce Homo, "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it, but love it." This is the radical challenge that Nietzsche throws down to us. Can we love not just the moments of joy and pleasure, but also those of pain and suffering? Can we affirm life in its totality without exceptions? Can we say yes not just to what pleases us, but also to what challenges us, hurts us, breaks us? The eternal return is, therefore, the supreme test of life affirmation. If you can wish that your life repeats exactly as it was eternally, then you have achieved what Nietzsche considers the most affirmative possible attitude toward existence. In his most personal writings, Nietzsche describes his own path to amor fati through years of debilitating illness, isolation, and incomprehension. In a letter to a friend, he described how he transformed his suffering into something positive. "I owe much to my illness. More than to my health. I owe it a higher health, one that is strengthened by everything that does not kill it." This is perhaps the clearest expression of what Nietzsche considered the mark of true greatness, the capacity to transform even suffering into something valuable, into something that strengthens rather than weakens. And this brings us to what Nietzsche called great style. In his writings on aesthetics, he develops the idea that life should be lived as a work of art, not in the superficial sense of mere appearance or display, but in the profound sense of creatively giving form to the raw material of existence. Great style for Nietzsche is the capacity to impose order on chaos without denying the chaos, to create harmony from dissonance without suppressing the dissonance. It is the integration of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, the principle of order, structure, and form with the principle of ecstasy, chaos, and dissolution. Applied to life, great style means living in a way that affirms both joy and suffering, both order and chaos, both creation and destruction. It is to dance on the edge of the abyss, aware of the nothingness that surrounds us, yet still creating beauty and meaning out of that nothingness. Here is where Nietzsche most clearly shows himself to be a philosopher, not of despair, but of profound affirmation. Despite his devastating critique of conventional morality, religion, and metaphysics, he does not leave us in the void of nihilism. Instead, he offers a vision of life as a work of art, of existence as an exercise in continuous creation. This vision is captured most poetically in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where Nietzsche writes about the three transformations of the spirit. First, the spirit becomes a camel, bearing the weight of the values of tradition. Then the spirit becomes a lion, who says no to the thou shalt, and reclaims freedom. Finally, the spirit becomes a child, a sacred yes to life, who can create new values. The child represents the final stage of spiritual evolution for Nietzsche. It is not a return to naivety or irresponsibility, but a recovery of innocence after experience, an affirmation of life after having confronted its most terrible dimensions. What Nietzsche offers, then, is not a philosophy of despair or destruction, but a philosophy of radical affirmation. As he writes in The Gay Science, I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Thus I will be one of those who make things beautiful. Amor fati. Let that be my love. Henceforth, this is the essence of Nietzsche's philosophy. Not to flee from reality no matter how terrible it may seem, but to embrace it, affirm it, transform it into something beautiful, through the creative power of the will. What does this mean for you today? How can you apply these profound and challenging insights to your life in the 21st century? Start by questioning your most fundamental values. Where do they come from? Did you choose them consciously, or did you passively absorb them from family, culture, religion, or media? Do they expand your life or contract it? Do they increase your power or diminish it? Do they arise from life affirmation or from resentment against life? Nietzsche invites us to see morality not as a fixed code of universal rules, but as a work of art in constant evolution, something we continuously create through our choices and actions. This doesn't mean that anything goes in a simplistic sense, but that we are responsible for creating values that enhance life rather than diminish it. The second aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy that you can apply to your life is the concept of becoming who you are. This means discovering and affirming your deepest nature, with all its contradictions and complexities, rather than trying to mold yourself according to external expectations. This is not a simple task. As Nietzsche observed in Ecce Homo, to become what one is, one must not have the faintest notion what one is. Paradoxically, to become who you are, you must first recognize that you don't know who you are, that the identity you believe you possess is, to a large extent, a social construction, a collection of masks and roles you've learned to play. The process of becoming who you are involves what Nietzsche called the free spirit, the capacity to question everything you believe to be true about yourself and the world. In Human All Too Human, he writes, a free spirit. This cold concept will be misunderstood when I think of those who, for lack of self-discipline or by debauchery, perhaps only imagine or desire an absolute freedom of will or action. The true free spirit is not the libertine who simply gives in to all impulses, nor the rebel who automatically rejects all conventions. It is the individual who has conquered the internal freedom to critically examine each belief, each value, each aspect of their identity, and consciously choose which to affirm and which to reject. Finally, you can apply to your life the principle of amor fati, learning to love not just what is pleasant or easy in your life, but also what is difficult, painful, challenging. As Nietzsche wrote, the ideal of the most high-spirited, alive, and world-affirming human being, who has not only learned to compromise and arrange with that which was and is, but who wants to have it again as it was and is, for all eternity. This doesn't mean passively accepting unjust or oppressive circumstances. On the contrary, it means transforming even the most difficult experiences into opportunities for growth and self-discovery. It means recognizing that who you are today is the result of everything you've experienced, the good, the bad, the terrible, and that to reject any part of your history is to reject part of yourself. If you take Nietzsche's philosophy seriously, you will not find in it a set of rules to live by, but a challenge to create your own rules. You will not find a map of the territory, but an invitation to explore uncharted territories. You will not find definitive answers, but ever deeper questions. Nietzsche does not want followers who adopt his ideas without questioning. He wants readers who use his ideas as springboards for their own thinking. As he wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star, and perhaps this is, after all, the most profound invitation of Nietzschean philosophy, not to fear the chaos within us, not to run from the multiplicity of drives, instincts, and desires that constitute us, but to embrace them as the raw material from which we can create something beautiful, something powerful, something genuinely our own. Nietzsche's philosophy is ultimately a philosophy for creators, not just artists in the conventional sense, but creators of values, of meaning, of themselves. It is a philosophy that challenges us to live so intensely and authentically that we can look back without regret, that we can say to life once more, and again, ask yourself, am I living in a way that affirms life in its totality, or am I still trapped in patterns of resentment and negation? Am I creating values that expand my life, or just following values I've inherited without questioning? Am I becoming who I am, or still trying to be who others expect me to be? These are the questions that Nietzsche challenges us to ask. And perhaps the mark of greatness, according to his vision, is not having the right answers, but having the courage to keep asking the questions. If you found value in these reflections on Nietzsche's philosophy, subscribe to this channel, where I explore the insights of the greatest philosophers for those seeking a deeper, more authentic, more powerful life. Watch the video on your screen now about how Carl Jung took forward and transformed Nietzsche's psychological intuitions. Remember, becoming who you are is not a final destination, but an ongoing journey of self-overcoming. And the more you become aware of who you truly are, the less you can content yourself with diminished or falsified versions of yourself. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.